All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, as the Golden State Warriors dynasty continues along, Steve Kerr and Draymond Green are starting to remind me more and more of a husband and wife who are just staying together for the kids. It seems like at least 2 to 3 times a season, one or either one of them are caught on camera saying something inflammatory about the other. And this has been going on for about 4 or 5 years now. The difference is that I have the very sneaky suspicion that something is going to bubble over between those two, possibly either before the season ends or maybe in the off season after this season, particularly if the Golden State Warriors win another championship. Because I think that Draymond Green is reading the tea leaves and he sees that the Golden State front office is willing to do anything to keep Kevin Durant, even if it means trading him. So when Draymond Green decided that he was going to sign with Rich Paul, that was his way of putting on his proverbial bulletproof vest for what he thinks is coming for him this offseason. Because Draymond knows that based on many of his outbursts and his uprisings in the locker room against Steve Kerr, etc., he's made himself relatively expendable because his numbers and his play have dropped off. And then in addition to that, Steve Kerr was recently caught on camera saying, "I'm so sick of Draymond's shit." That's not something that someone says in a fit of rage or in a moment of instability. That's something that a coach says when he wishes that he could get rid of a certain player, but he does not know who around the league would be able to replace what he brings to the table. And that's what I've been telling you brothers about Draymond for a very long time now. They would move him, but there's really no other player in the league like him. And then on top of that, you have the rapport between Draymond and Steve Kerr of MK asset and MK handler. All top coaches in sports are MK handlers, especially basketball. And I've already laid out, I won't say in detail, but in relative detail in one of these other videos, I think that it was in the Adam Gase video, that Steve Kerr's family has a background associated with the CIA. And that strangely enough, his brother is a professor at Michigan State, which also in my view is very clearly a hub for the MK Ultra program. That's the reason why I believe that Draymond Green has many of those moments where he freezes. That in conjunction with his number, as well as some of the imagery that is very surreptitiously placed in some of his commercials, tells me that there's a bit more than meets the eye with Draymond Green. It's neither here nor there. He's not the only MK asset on that team, because I believe that Steph Curry is another Monarch athlete. Either way, the clock is ticking on Draymond Green, and he better be very much aware of it. So anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
The lip reader's been wrong. What I said was, I beg to differ with Draymond's approach tonight. Those are my exact words. I don't know how somebody misconstrued that.
Kerr always tries to hide who he really is through silly humor. That's one of the mechanisms that the Caucasian liberals love to use, especially when they get caught being who they really are. They try to pour a little water on it by making little silly jokes. And I have no problem with it. Steve Kerr is an authoritarian. He's a coach. He's supposed to get upset by buffoonery. Draymond Green utilizes a lot of buffoonery and stupidity as part of his hijinks.
It's modern life. Everything's recorded. Everything is filmed. I've decided I'm now going to get a giant laminated board with all of my play calls, and I'm going to turn into an NFL coach from here on out.
I hate that part of modern life. All right, Warriors Steve Kerr downplaying the Draymond Green criticism, using humor, obviously, there, that the lip readers were wrong. Max, what did you think of Kerr's reaction?
I actually thought that was huge. I think Kerr is a really underrated coach. And, you know, Phil Jackson, there was always this raging debate. Is he one of the greatest coaches of all time, or is he just overrated and anyone with Jordan and Pippen and then Shaq and Kobe, or Kobe and Powell could win?
I've always heard that ridiculous contention about Phil Jackson. And the response should always be, well, if anyone could win with that talent, how come anyone didn't win with that talent? How come it took Phil Jackson? The LA Lakers had coaches there before Phil Jackson came on. They were unsuccessful. The Bulls had Doug Collins. He was not successful. As a matter of fact, he and Jordan were always at each other's throats. Doug Collins was the absolute worst coach for Michael Jordan, even though Doug Collins is a very good coach. Personality-wise, he and Jordan just didn't mesh. And beyond that, Doug Collins did not have the personality to be a top head coach in the NBA because he was too emotional. Jordan was a fiery guy, so he needed somebody who was psychological. He needed someone who was contemplative. someone who sat back and was meditative, who would think things out and was cool-headed. That was Phil Jackson. He balanced out Jordan's fiery nature. Doug Collins was also fiery, so they would just butt heads all the time. That's the same reason why Phil Jackson was able to bring out the best in Kobe Bryant, because Kobe was very similar. He was also very fiery. Phil Jackson was able to utilize a lot of psychological machinations to get what he wanted out of those teams. Steve Kerr comes from the Phil Jackson / Greg Popovich school of MK handling.
I don't care who you got, 11 rings, everyone, stop. At this level, the kind of psychology of the team and the way a coach handles that is at least half the job. Look, do the Warriors know how to play? Does Kerr's system work? Stephen A., you give Mark Jackson a lot of credit for bringing them along. Absolutely, he deserves that credit. But when the Warriors made that move, and guys like Iguodala were mad about it, by the way, right? Because Mark Jackson had gotten the Splash Brothers to believe in themselves, called them the greatest shooters ever, like early on. But the team wasn't moving the ball. And Kerr came in and unlocked an offensive potential there.
Of course, because he's a championship level coach. As I've stated in the past, there are coaches that are just good enough to get you good, and then there are championship level coaches. And all championship level coaches have to tap into the psychological / psychiatric aspect of sports. They all do. If you can't tap into the mental aspect, you're not going to win. Because once you get to the elite level, especially the championship level, physically, for the most part, the teams are relatively even. It's really just about how the coach, aka the MK handler, is able to galvanize his troops and utilize certain tactics on the basketball floor that can bring out the best in his team.
They were, the ball doesn't stick with anyone. They play. It's one of the reasons Kevin Durant wanted to play there. Like, that's the way basketball should be played. So his system works. We know these guys can play. We know they have the talent. So when something goes wrong, what goes wrong? It's managing egos, boredom. You mentioned Stephen A. rising to the level of competition. So to get caught on video saying he's tired of Draymond's you-know-what, and then to respond to the media, no, they got the lip reading wrong. What I said was, I beg to differ with Draymond's approach tonight. Not only does that perfectly handle the situation and put it to bed and point out without even him having to say it, but he said it.
No, that puts it to bed for the simpletons. For those of us in the know, as well as Draymond Green, that does not put anything to bed. But understand something. Draymond Green already knows that Steve Kerr does not like him. In the same way, Draymond does not like Steve Kerr. But Draymond is mature enough at this point in his career to understand that if he starts getting into a back and forth with his coach, especially publicly or even privately, he's once again going to be associated with the quote-unquote distraction or being the diversion that might stop his team from winning another championship. And he cannot do that at this point in his career. He's around 30 years old and he's looking for a big-time contract. And if the teams are looking at him and saying to themselves, you cost your team 2 championships in 4 years, and you're an aging defensive superstar, why in the world should we give you anywhere near the max, especially if Golden State did not want to? He knows he's finished. So right now, Draymond has to take low in this situation. But believe me, he wants to get at Steve Kerr over this.
This is basket NBA, man. This happens on every team all the time. No big deal. But it handles it in the best possible way. If people think it's just easy to be a coach of a really talented team, ask Brad Stevens this year. It's not so easy. But Steve Kerr makes it look easy. He is a great and underrated coach, and he just gave you an example why.
He's definitely a great coach, no doubt about that.
He's a phenomenal coach. He's a phenomenal coach, and one would argue an even better person. He's
You don't know him to say that, Stephen A. Smith.
One of the most kind and more decent people that you'd ever come across in this profession. And
the only reason why you're saying that is because you feel guilty due to the fact that after your boy Mark Jackson got fired, you threw all type of insults at Steve Kerr. And all he ended up doing was becoming the winningest coach in his first 5 or 6 years in the history of the NBA.
And I'm honored to be covering him. Let me say this.
Yeah, I believe this is his 5th year.
It was never a big deal to me, and it has nothing to do with his reaction. It has everything to do, if you know anything about sports and you know anything about playing basketball particularly, that's virtually nothing. Now, the interesting part is not about Steve Kerr. It's how Draymond Green takes it.
Absolutely.
It's how Draymond Green absorbs it and what great Draymond Green will react to it.
Right now, Draymond can't flip out. As I've already stated, Draymond is in a very precarious situation right now. Golden State is trying to win their third straight championship. They also have a free agent in Kevin Durant, who's widely considered by many of the NBA's fans as being the new best player in the NBA. Draymond already has been blamed for a blow-up between himself and that player, which many people started to attribute to Draymond Green's incessant need to be the center of attention and to be an agent of chaos. Also understanding implicitly that if the Golden State Warriors were to not win the championship, they would blame him. Right now, Draymond has to keep a very low profile.
But what Steve Kerr said, it was caught, by some lip reader saying, I assure you, coaches have said and done far worse. See, we live in a different age, Molly. See, when I was playing college ball, I got slapped upside my head.
Absolutely. When they ask you to go get that water for the guys who are actually playing the game, you better get that damn water. And then on top of that, you sitting at the very end of the bench, and you don't even have the decency to pick up the towels.
Physically, bow, by Coach Clarence Big House Gates, along with various others, unapologetically, and we wouldn't even think to say anything about to him or about it. It was par for the course. Don't get me started with the kind of things that John Chaney has said to some people. Say the George Ravelins of the world, 40 Minutes of Hell, Nolan Richardson, John Thompson. Oh my God, have you sat down and had a conversation with John Thompson?
Oh no, John Thompson will curse you out and then whoop your ass.
And I brought up the black coaches for a reason, because they're very, very bad in that regard, or good, depending on how you interpret it. And some white coaches are just as bad as well.
Ain't nobody worse than Bobby Knight. Bobby Knight would curse you out, your mama out, whoop your ass. Bobby Knight used to go recruit in the hood, didn't give a shit, and will fight anybody. Bobby Knight also came from the same tree as Krzyzewski.
I mean, everybody couldn't be Dean Smith or come across as polished, and professional as Mike Krzyzewski. I mean, when you think about Bobby Knight,
all handlers. Bobby Knight, Dean Smith, Mike Krzyzewski, all MK handlers.
Please understand, as extreme as he was to so many people, particularly in this day and age, we're like, damn, you actually get in trouble for that? Because, this is what we ran across a lot, because it was that crazy. So having said all of that, let's look at Steve Kerr's resume. He's an 8-time champion. He's got 5 rings as a player.
Right, but not even talking about him as a player, Stephen A. Smith. Just as a coach, the dude has 3 championships in 4 years and seems to be heading for a 4th championship in 5 years.
3 as coach. And if Mike D'Antoni had listened to him and brought in Tom Thibodeau as his defensive wizard as a coach, he might have had 9 or 10 championships with that crew that they had back in the day, Max. You appreciate this. Amari Stoudemire, Joe Johnson, Sean Marion.
They had a good crew, but that team was never going to win. They were not smart enough offensively in the playoffs. They had that one season where they came pretty close to beating San Antonio. I think it was 07, but they were never going to get over the hump. D'Antoni is not a championship coach.
These brothers could have won the title. If they had somebody. This is what Steve Kerr wanted when he was the GM. So not only is he a champion as a player, not only is he a champion as a coach, he probably might have been a champion as a general manager as well. So when we hear something like this, I appreciate the fact that he's joking, because he could have been serious and said this. Do y'all know who I am? Do you realize that this is nothing? Will y'all shut the hell up and go?
Well, he's not going to do that, Stephen A. Smith, because that's against his brand. Once again, Steve Kerr is a Caucasian super liberal. He cannot break his brand. He can't break character. If he were to become overly confrontational to the media, that's going to set a precedent that he's not going to want to have to deal with down the line, because they will reflect back on him losing his composure. Right now, his brand is basically he's another one of these super liberal Caucasian coaches who tacitly is trying to convey that he has to deal with the white man's burden. That being that he has to be a shining light to the masses and assist so-called black people in their struggle any way that he can, or at least act as if he is, so that he can get the best out of them. Because once again, people like Greg Popovich, Steve Kerr, they're going to play that role so that they can get black athletes to invest in the success of the team.
go and stop wasting my time with this nonsense and come out with something more substantive. He could have said that.
You bring up the racial component of it, which I find interesting because
I was just saying it.
But actually, I think there is one here. You know, Jalen Rose brought up earlier that when you're a kid, who's in the stands changes. The racial composition of the people in the stands. By the time you get to the NBA, you went from when you were in high school, a lot of black people to a lot of white people by the time you're in the pros, right?
Absolutely.
Right? And there are jokes in American culture about the fact that there's like usually a white coach and whoever's on the floor at the time, 5 black players, you know, African American players, although that's changed in the NBA a bit with the influx of players from Europe and South America. But Steve Kerr, when he took over that team, took over from whom? Mark Jackson, an African American coach. Players, I mentioned Iguodala, like Iguodala, had a problem with it, partly along racial lines, and said so. Said so in articles. You can read them. They're online. You know, like, yeah.
I think that it was relatively prevalent at that time that there must have been some racial component to why Mark Jackson was let go and Steve Kerr brought in. This was a so-called black coach who had taken Golden State out of the doldrums and led them to a 50-win season or a 50-win-ish type team. And then for him to get let go like that after they lose a 7-game first-round series to the Clippers, it seemed very strange. Fortunately for Steve Kerr, he was able to bring in a system that optimized all of the components on the team, therefore making people forget Mark Jackson very quickly.
I had to know. And Steve Kerr had to figure out a way to gain the trust of his players, to be a guy whose system they could buy into, to be the kind of personality that wore well over time.
Well, fortunately for Steve, he was able to sell Steph Curry. Remember, and many people forget this, Draymond Green was a bench player under Mark Jackson. It was Steve Kerr who decided to start Draymond over, what's this guy's name? David Lee. That's what I'm thinking of. It was Steve Kerr who swapped out David Lee for Draymond Green. And he really is responsible for the prominence that Draymond Green has been able to ascend to in the NBA. And of course, Draymond's hard work and his basketball IQ. But because Golden State was still in the process of figuring itself out and how to get to the next level when it comes to winning in the playoffs, that's why there was only so much that they could complain about with Steve Kerr, because from his first season, I think that they started out the 2014-2015 season by winning their first 14 games. So right off the bat, they forgot about Mark Jackson pretty quickly.
Remember, he didn't just learn under Phil Jackson, also Greg Popovich.
Ding.
And the way he handled this, like you say, oh, it's no big deal, whatever, this happens all the time. But I could see a coach mishandling this and this turning into a bigger deal with Draymond.
A more insecure coach who's not trained in psychological maneuverings, yes. I could certainly see him mishandling this.
The way he handled this totally diffuses it. If you're Draymond Green and you hear your coach do that, it's like, right, it doesn't matter.
Piggyback off.
No, if you're Draymond Green, you're saying to yourself, this MF is up to his old tricks. I know that he's up to something. I promise you that's what Draymond's thinking. But he got to chill right now because the block is hot with him. He knows he can't stir the pot right now, not until they win a championship.
Back off your point, though, I think it's important to point this out.
Or at least he should know that.
Steph Curry deserves a boatload of credit
because he bought in.
Because when you have a star like Steph Curry, who is the face of your franchise, who buys in, it makes it easier to sell to everybody. Like, for example, Greg Popovich. Let me tell you something, and I've often said this, and I've said this affectionately, not insultingly in any way. Greg Popovich, at least years ago, was one of, you looked at him as a big phony from the perspective. He is incredibly nice.
He is a big phony.
And decent. This guy that you see, this acerbic personality, talking to reporters during the game because he doesn't want to be bothered while the game is going on. If you sit down and you talk to Greg Popovich, you'd be hard pressed to find a better man. He's that special kind of.
He's still a big phony, Stephen A. Smith.
Kind of a guy. But guess what? It helped that when he wanted to be acerbic, when he wanted to be a bit truculent or whatever, it was Tim Duncan he could get on, and Tim Duncan would take it. Because if Tim Duncan took it, what excuse does anybody else have not to take it?
Well, in the same way, you have Bill Belichick, who uses Tom Brady as his sounding board and as his whipping boy. And we know that Tom Brady is a monarch athlete, and Bill Belichick is an MK handler. Just to get back to Greg Popovich and Tim Duncan, it's very obvious that Tim Duncan is probably a Monarch athlete as well. And as I've stated, there's no doubt in my mind that Greg Popovich is a handler.
And that was what they got help. When you're helped by your superstar, it matters.
The best coaches on the greatest dynasties usually have a captain on the floor that's an extension of them in some way. And one of the issues with the Celtics right now, and we've been into it, is obviously Coach wanted that to be Gordon Hayward, right? But in fact, it's Kyrie, and I think that team is figuring it out right now.
Years ago, Larry Brown, one of his tussles with Allen Iverson, benches Allen Iverson. That night, Greg Popovich benched Tim Duncan for no reason. And Tim Duncan didn't say a word because Popovich was looking out for his boy Larry Brown, showing how it could be done when you have a superstar. Allen Iverson and everybody else in the NBA, it didn't escape any of us.
Stephen A. Smith basically just told a slave story and he don't even realize it. So Allen Iverson gets benched by Larry Brown, and and Greg Popovich, in an attempt to show, number one, solidarity, number two, that we always gonna keep you niggas in your place, he benches Tim Duncan as well, and Stephen A. Smith tells that story with pride. And Tim Duncan just sits his happy ass on the sideline and says nothing. That's how you know that Tim Duncan was as much a golem for Greg Popovich as he was a star player. And that is why Popovich did not know what to do when he finally had a star player turn against him.
Yeah, but Kerr playing it perfectly and stopped it from escalating publicly. So good job by him as always. Russell.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. I don't believe that we've heard the last of this storyline between Steve Kerr and Draymond Green. Draymond is an asset who's very rebellious to his programming. He always flips out. But once again, it's so funny hearing Stephen A. Smith tell that story about Greg Popovich, and he tells it with pride like it's a good thing. No, it's not a good thing that Tim Duncan allowed himself to be benched and used as a pawn by Greg Popovich, because Popovich had to show that he was going to be in line or in league with Larry Brown and show that the slave master had total control over the slave. Now, Larry Brown had a reason to bench Allen Iverson. Popovich did not. So that was a mismanagement. That was a misuse of his power. And once again, that is why he could not deal with Kawhi Leonard when Kawhi Leonard rebelled against him. So peace.